John, a young delivery rider, lived each day like a battle against time and harsh conditions. One hot summer day, with the sun still high in the sky, he began his delivery route. Despite being tired and thirsty, John constantly reminded himself to push through because his job was the only thing keeping him afloat. After finishing a nearby order, he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant to ask if he could use the restroom before continuing his delivery to a customer on the other side of the city. The restaurant was crowded, with laughter and the sizzling sound of frying pans filling the air. John, though exhausted, walked in with hopes of getting a little break. However, when he politely asked Mrs. Lin, the owner of the store, for permission to use the restroom, he was met with a cold look and a sharp response: "There's no place for you here." The words hit him like a cold splash of water. It wasn't just the denial, it was the indifference in her voice. John stood there for a moment, stunned, before frustration started to rise within him. He couldn't believe he was being treated this way when all he wanted was a short break to rest before continuing his long journey. He tried to swallow his anger, but inside, a sense of dissatisfaction began to grow. He realized that no matter how he reacted, the job had to go on. There was no other choice but to nod, turn away, and walk out. Sweat was still trickling down his face, his hands shaking from thirst. John got back on his bike, and the wheels began to roll down the hot, blistering road. He wondered why he had to endure this. The feelings of abandonment and loneliness grew stronger, but there was nothing he could do. He had to keep going, for his family was waiting for simple meals and the money that kept them going day by day. With every pedal, John felt like he was about to collapse. But he couldn't stop, because if he did, everything would fall apart. And after all, this was the path he had chosen, the path of a faceless, nameless delivery rider, always fighting against himself and the unrelenting circumstances that surrounded him. Despite the growing exhaustion and frustration swelling inside him, John couldn't stop. He pedaled through the scorching heat, each stop to catch his breath only made him feel like he was losing precious moments. The intense midday sun, combined with the fatigue, made the long stretch of road feel endless. Sweat soaked through his shirt, and each drop seemed to weigh him down further, but there was no time to rest. He knew that if he didn't make the delivery on time, no one would understand what he had gone through, and he wouldn't earn a penny for his efforts. As he neared the delivery address, John felt like he was running on autopilot. His body screamed for rest, but he pushed forward, trying to shake off the fatigue that clouded his mind. It wasn't until a sleek luxury car drove by that he felt a pang of frustration. The passenger in the car, a well-dressed woman, looked at him with an inquisitive expression. That gaze, full of judgment and curiosity, stung. He knew she would never understand the hardship he was enduring. Yet, he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He had a job to do. He gritted his teeth and continued, dragging his tired body to the door of the customer's house. When he handed over the food, the feeling of relief was almost overwhelming. For a brief moment, it felt like he was free from the weight of the world. But that sense of freedom lasted only a second, replaced quickly by the realization that there was still so much more to be done. His journey wasn't over. The miles ahead seemed endless, and with each passing moment, his exhaustion grew. As John headed back to the restaurant to pick up another order, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Why did life have to be this difficult? Why was he always the one carrying the burden? No one ever saw the effort, the long hours, or the sweat. All they saw was a delivery rider, faceless and nameless. He thought back to Mrs. Lin, the store owner, who had treated him so coldly earlier. It hurt that someone could dismiss him so easily, just because he wasn't a customer. But as those thoughts lingered, something unexpected happened. When John arrived back at the fast food restaurant, he wasn't sure what to expect. He certainly didn't anticipate seeing Mrs. Lin again. But there she was, standing behind the counter, her gaze meeting his. This time, her eyes weren't as cold as before. There was a flicker of something, maybe regret, maybe acknowledgement, but it was hard to tell. She didn't speak immediately, just looked at him with a certain hesitation. John stood there, unsure of what to say, feeling the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had braced himself for another round of indifference, but what he saw in her eyes made him pause. It was as if, for the first time, she saw him, not just as a delivery rider, but as a person. The silence between them stretched on, and for a moment, John wondered what was going through her mind. Had she realized something about him that she hadn't before? Or was this just another fleeting moment, a small gesture that wouldn't change anything? John stood there, his exhaustion weighing heavily on him, as he stared into Mrs. Lin's eyes. The familiar hum of the fast food restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving only the silence between them. It was an uncomfortable stillness, one filled with unspoken words and unresolved tension. His body ached, his mind clouded by the relentless fatigue of the day, but in that moment, everything felt suspended. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to see Mrs. Lin again, let alone have this strange, heavy encounter. The frustration he had carried with him since she had rejected him earlier began to rise again, but it was different now. Her gaze wasn't cold or dismissive like before. There was something there, something that John couldn't quite place. It wasn't pity, but rather something closer to understanding. Mrs. Lin didn't immediately speak, instead she simply stood there, looking at him as if she were considering her next words carefully. John's heart beat faster, unsure of what to do or say. He had prepared himself for a second round of rejection, but what he saw in her eyes made him hesitate. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Lin let out a deep breath, her shoulders dropping slightly as if she were releasing a weight she had been carrying. She took a small step forward, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a napkin to wipe her brow, trying to appear composed, though John could see the subtle vulnerability in her. I didn't think you'd come back, she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard. There was a certain sheepishness in her tone, something that felt out of place for the stern woman he had encountered earlier. I'm sorry for turning you away before. I didn't understand your job. I didn't understand what you go through every day. John was taken aback by her apology. He had braced himself for another cold dismissal, another round of indifference, but instead, he was met with a moment of genuine reflection. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. It wasn't a full apology, but it was enough to make him stop and reconsider the situation. His anger began to ebb away, replaced by a strange mix of relief and disbelief. For a few moments, John stood in silence, absorbing what had just been said. His emotions, which had been so volatile only moments ago, began to settle into something quieter, something closer to understanding. He had always thought of himself as nothing more than a delivery rider to the people he served, just a nameless figure going about his work. But now, standing in front of Mrs. Lin, he wondered if maybe there was more to it. Maybe she wasn't just a cold-hearted businesswoman, maybe she, too, was struggling in her own way, caught up in the demands of her life, just like him. Don't apologize, John replied, his voice softer than usual. He paused, gathering his thoughts, trying to find the right words. I get it. I understand what you're saying. But sometimes, just a little kindness, a little recognition, goes a long way. We all have our own battles, and sometimes it's easy to forget that we're all human. Mrs. Lin stood still, her eyes flicking to the floor for a moment, as if she were processing his words. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt like a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the hardships each of them had been carrying. After a long pause, she finally nodded slowly, as if accepting the weight of what he had said. "I know," she murmured. "I'm learning. It's just hard sometimes. I don't always know how to reach out, to connect with others." Her voice trailed off, and for a brief moment, she seemed vulnerable, as if she were revealing something personal. "I never realized how much small gestures, simple things, could make a difference. I've been so focused on the business that I've forgotten what it means to care." John could feel his frustration fading. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just in her, it was in him too. He had come to the restaurant expecting nothing but more hardship, but instead, he had found a glimpse of empathy, a recognition of the struggles they both faced. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him feel heard, seen, even if just for a moment. "I guess we all have room to grow," John said, offering a small, tired smile. "It's not easy, but sometimes, the hardest part is just acknowledging that we're all in this together." Mrs. Lin returned the smile, a subtle but genuine one. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'll do better. I'll try to remember that people like you, people who do the hard work every day, deserve more than just a quick transaction. You deserve respect." John nodded, feeling a small weight lift off his chest. "Thank you," he said, as he turned to leave. As he stepped out of the restaurant, he felt a slight sense of relief. The road ahead was still long, and the day wasn't over, but something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just a faceless delivery man anymore. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen. As John stepped out of the restaurant, the weight of the day seemed to lift, if only slightly. His body was still aching from the long ride, the unrelenting heat, and the stress of the constant hustle. But as he pedaled away from the fast food joint, something had changed. The streets, though still busy and overwhelming, felt a little less harsh, as though the air around him had cleared just a bit. The interactions with Mrs. Lin, however brief and awkward, had left a mark on him. For the first time that day, he felt seen, understood, even if just for a moment. John continued his deliveries, pushing through the city streets, but the emotional weight of the encounter lingered. It wasn't a grand resolution or a perfect reconciliation, but it was a small, significant step. A reminder that sometimes, human connection didn't need to be profound or life-changing, it could simply be an acknowledgement of each other's struggles. And that, in itself, made all the difference. As he neared the next drop-off point, he saw a group of his fellow riders, all sweating and tired from their long shifts. They waved to him as he approached, their faces familiar and comforting in their shared exhaustion. John returned their wave, offering a tired but genuine smile. In that moment, he realized that he wasn't alone. He wasn't just another delivery guy, riding through the city on his own. He was part of something bigger, a community of people who, though often invisible to others, were making the world turn, one small task at a time. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, John found himself at the final stop of the day. His legs were sore, his body drained, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his chest. It wasn't about the money, or the recognition. It was about the connection, however fleeting, that made the work feel worth it. And as he handed the last order over, he realized that sometimes, the hardest part wasn't the work itself, it was the human connection that made it all bearable. Riding home, John reflected on the day's events. He had been rejected, dismissed, and overlooked, but he had also been acknowledged. He had been given a glimpse of the understanding he had so longed for, even if it was just a crack in the door. And that was enough to keep him going. He knew the road ahead would still be tough. The city would still feel indifferent at times, and there would always be challenges to face. But in that moment, John felt a small, quiet hope. It was a hope that maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to stay the way they were. That change could happen, even in the smallest of ways, and perhaps, that was enough. As the night settled around him, John took a deep breath, his heart a little lighter than before, and pedaled forward into the unknown.